Greetings, my name is Kerry and welcome back to my channel. Today I have another recent reads video for you. So I mentioned in my last recent reads video that I finished 12 books quite close together, so here are the next 6 that I finished. I read all of these within the last week at time of filming, well, finished reading them all. Without further ado, I'm just going to get into the books. So the first book I'm going to talk about today was Born a Crime by Trevor Noah. This is his memoir of growing up mixed race in South Africa at a time when that was not legal. His mother decided she wanted to have a mixed race child and chose to sleep with a white man to be able to have a mixed race child, and she knew that that was illegal at the time. This is a series of stories from Trevor's childhood and young adulthood about what it was like growing up in that environment under apartheid, and sort of with the breaking down of apartheid as well, how he had to try and find his way when he didn't really fit in anywhere. Told with great humour and great sensitivity as well. A lot of the stuff he lived through and dealt with was not easy things to go through, so I need to give quite a few content warnings for this book. For domestic violence, I think is the main one, but also quite a lot of racial discrimination and occasional use of racial slurs as well. A little bit of like on the page violence and a little bit of animal cruelty as well. I think that's everything. Yeah, so a really interesting look at life under apartheid and after, like when that was starting to break down. Really interesting insight to growing up in South Africa at that time, particularly as a mixed race person. I really enjoyed this book. I found it really interesting and was really good to read. Okay, the next book that I finished was Foundryside by Robert Jackson Bennett. This is the first in the Founders trilogy. I was buddy reading this with some booktube friends and really enjoyed it. I had not heard of this series before or this author, and then when they said they were buddy reading it and I found I could get it from the library, I decided to join them, and I'm really glad I did. So this follows the story of Sancha, who is a bit of an outcast. She's a thief. She lives in a poor area called Foundryside, which is there's a city with a lot of merchant guilds who run everything. So within their houses, their compounds, everything is quite well run, but then sort of the dregs of society live outside of those compounds in places like Foundryside. The magic system in this book series is to do with something called scribing, which is where they write essentially codes onto items and that changes the reality of that item. So like they can write something that makes the wall think it's heavier than it is, or like they use it a lot on their weapons to change the gravity of that thing so it thinks it's falling, which makes it move faster, that sort of thing. It's quite a complex system, but it's quite similar in some ways to computer coding. That's what it really reminded us of when we were talking about this. Sancha is unique because she is a human that has been scribed, so she has a plate in her head which has scribings on it, and that alters her reality, so she can sense buildings and she can sense scribed items. She is tasked with stealing a small box from the docks, and she's not meant to open the box, but she does, and she finds that it has a key in it, and when she touches the key she finds she can talk to this key. The key is called Clef and it has a sentience, and so part of the book is trying to figure out what happened to Clef to make him into a key. And then also there are a number of other people that are trying to get hold of the key, and the story kind of develops from there. There's this whole sort of mythology about people called the Hierophants who invented scribing, but then their civilization was lost, and so part of it is people trying to figure out what happened to that civilization, and there's just a lot of intrigue, politics between the different merchant houses, and lots of crazy plans and plots that the characters come up with to try and achieve their aims. I really liked this. I really liked Sancha as a main character. I liked that she is like a powered person, a person with abilities, but she is not happy about it. She doesn't like what has been done to her and how it affects her, because it like distances her from people and it makes her life really difficult because she can't touch things without getting like a sense of their thoughts, even buildings and that. So it makes her life a lot more difficult. So that was quite refreshing to me, because that is not a conversation that we often have about powered characters with special abilities. It was refreshing to see one that wasn't happy with having those abilities. I really liked the relationships between the different characters. It's kind of a bit of a found family storyline. There's a number of different characters who are all quite misfits, and then they all find that they have to work together. Initially they don't really want to try and like achieve the same aims, and I really liked the interplay of their characters. I really loved Clef as an inanimate object but a great character, and I really liked the relationship between him and Sancho and how that worked, and I'm really excited to carry on this series. So the second book is out, which is called Shorefall. I don't know when the third book is coming out. I'm hopefully gonna try and get to Shorefall fairly soon when I can buy a copy, and I gave this one 5 stars. The next book that I finished was called Slay in Your Lane, which was an ebook I got from the library. I'm going to do my best to say the author's names correctly. And so this was written by Yomi Adegoke and Elizabeth Uvibinené. I did mean to check out to make sure I was going to pronounce those right, and I didn't. I forgot. So hopefully I've said those names correctly. I really do apologise if I haven't. This is subtitled The Black Girl Bible, and it is written about what it means to be a young black woman in Britain. I found this really inspiring. I know I'm not the target audience for it, and so I can only imagine how impactful it would be to a young black woman reading it, but I found it really inspiring and also really eye-opening to see, like, I've been reading quite a lot about racial discrimination in some of the other books I've been reading, and I've also been reading quite a lot about gender discrimination, and black women suffer from both those types of discrimination. So there are situations where a black man is more privileged because he's a man, and there are situations where a white woman is more privileged because she's white, but black women miss out on both of those types of privilege. So it was really interesting to see that and how negatively black women are impacted by a lot of situations, but also it was really inspiring. So they interviewed a lot of black women and got a lot of input from people who have been really successful in their fields and a lot of inspiration from them. So I found that actually pretty inspiring myself. The book was broken down into different sections on advice on different topics, and actually there were 2 chapters on dating, and the second of those had better advice in it than I think all of the other books I've ever read about dating in my life. So that was really good. Yeah, I mean, I don't have a lot more to say about it, just I found it really interesting, and it was actually really good as well because a number of the other books that I've been reading about racial inequality have been more of an American setting, so to have this one as a British setting was certainly very interesting and a good insight into what is happening in my own country. So moving on to Provenance by Anne Leckie. This is a science fiction book, and it is set in the same universe as the Imperial Raj trilogy, which I finished earlier this year. It happens slightly after the events of those books, and you don't need to have read them to be able to read this book. It is a standalone, but some of the context and some of the background will make more sense if you've read that trilogy first. But I know that some people struggle with particularly Ancillary Justice, the first book in that trilogy, because of the way it's written and the perspective of the character, and like the characters in that series are gender blind, so they refer to everyone as she because that is the tradition within the Rajai Empire where that is set. This book is set on the edge of that empire and has a different gender system. So it's a little bit more accessible in some senses. So if you do want to read Anne Leckie's books, but you're a bit intimidated by the Imperial Raj trilogy, because I know that some people do find that first book a bit off-putting, then this is maybe a slightly gentler introduction, and you get an insight into some of the different species and politics of that series, but maybe in a more accessible format. This book follows a young woman called Ingray, who is the foster daughter of a politician, and she and her foster brother, they're both foster children, both adopted children, and they've always been kind of at odds because they don't know who is going to be the successor to their mother. Ingray comes up with this quite convoluted plot to try and gain power in that relationship, in that family, but things don't quite go to plan, and then they're affected by the arrival of a species called the Gek to their planet, which is linked to the events that happened in the Ancillary Justice series. And so it all gets a lot more complicated, and Ingray has to think on her feet a lot and try and figure out how she can make the best of the situation she finds herself in. What I liked about this book was Ingray was a really good character, a really good protagonist, because she gets herself into really difficult situations and then has to think her way out of them, and I thought that was just really funny that sometimes she could be like so dense that she would get herself into the situations, but then she also has to be really quite quick to get herself out of them again. So I really liked that interplay in that character. I enjoyed the society like that she lives in, and that reflection of gender I thought was actually really fascinating. In her society, people choose their gender and they choose their adult name, and that's what marks them becoming an adult, leaving childhood. And there were 3 genders, so there's man, woman and nomen, which is the 3rd gender. To start with, I was a little bit thrown because it was using gender, like this 3rd gender pronouns, which were E's and M's, and it slightly threw me because then when they were talking about children, they were using they them pronouns, and then I realised that this was how the society worked. So there were 3 genders and children choose their own gender when they reach adulthood, and that's how the society works. And I thought that was a really positive reflection of gender, and I really quite liked that. I really enjoyed the relationships between the characters. There was kind of a bit of a slow burn romance in there, a couple of them actually, which I really liked, and I just really enjoyed how the plot developed. So Anne Leckie is fast becoming one of my favourite authors. I have her first fantasy book that someone sent me earlier in the year to read, so I'm going to try and read that soon as well. And then I will have read all her books, and then I'll be impatiently awaiting for her to write more stuff. And at some point I will be buying my own copies of all of her sci-fi books as well, so that I can reread them. But just really enjoyed this. I think I gave this 4 stars because I didn't enjoy it quite as much as the other trilogy, but I really enjoyed being back in that universe. The next book that I finished was Magic Kingdom for Sale by Terry Brooks. So this is the first book in the Magic Kingdom of Landover series. It was alright. I didn't love it. I was going to say it took a bit to get into, but actually I got into the story quite quickly, but I think it just didn't feel like it delivered on what it promised. It didn't live up to my expectations really, I guess. So the basic storyline is Ben Holiday is a lawyer, but he's become quite dissatisfied with his life, and his wife has passed away a couple of years before, so he's just really in a place where he's quite unsatisfied. And then he gets a Christmas catalogue from a department store. It's called the Wish Book, and he comes across an article in there, an advert for a Magic Kingdom that he can buy for £1 million, which of course he has. So he debates for a little bit and then decides he's gonna go and buy this Magic Kingdom and become the king, and the story kind of develops from there. So it was moving quite well until he actually got to this Magic Kingdom, and then it was just like the brakes were on, and it was really then became really slow paced. As a central character, like, he was a little bit whiny and a bit annoying. I could kind of understand why, like, in the context, but I don't know, he just got on my nerves a little bit. And then the other thing that bothered me was that there were only 2 female characters, 3 if you count the dead wife, 4 if you count the castle, which for some reason was a woman. But the other 2 female characters that actually featured in the story, one was a witch and the other was a love interest, but they didn't feel like rounded characters, they just felt like plot devices. That bothered me. I think I've just been reading a lot of fantasy recently written by women, which has really good female characters in, or even like Boundary Side that I was talking about earlier, written by a man, but the female characters in that were so strong and so well rounded and so varied and different. Like, there were 4 central female characters in that, and they were all very different, have very different motivations, and then there were some other female side characters as well, whereas this only had like 2 female characters plus, I mean, the perfect dead wife. Yeah, I mean, it was written in like the 80s, but it bothered me. So I did have the second book in the series as well, but I'm not going to carry on with the series. I'm just going to unhaul both of them because I looked at some of the reviews for the second book, and one of them said that Ben gets even more whiny in the second book. So I'm not going to carry on with the series, but I'm glad that I've read it and I've got it off the TBR, and I know that I'm not going to enjoy the rest of the series, and I will be a bit wary of reading other Terry Brooks books in the future, so it's not an author I'm going to rush out and try and buy any of his other series to see if they're any better, at least not at the moment. Yeah, that was that one. And then finally I finished late last night, just about finished it in time. This is Lucky by Alice Sebold. So this is her memoir of her experience of being raped as a student in New York and what happens in the aftermath of that. She actually manages to take her rapist to trial. Yeah, this is a really powerful story. Really uncomfortable to read in quite a lot of places, understandably, and definitely content warnings for rape. It was a really powerful book in some senses. It's not a very comfortable subject to read about, obviously, and so it's not one that I've really ever read very much about before, but I'm really glad that I have read it now to understand that experience, and it's something that I hope I don't have to experience myself, but to have that sensitivity to what people might be going through, and the very different feeling that she had towards the end of the book. One of her friends is also raped, and then how she tries to deal with that situation. It was a really interesting insight into her mentality, and yeah, quite difficult to read most of the way through. But actually, one of the reasons I'm really glad I read it was right at the very end she talks about her realisation that she had PTSD, and although my trauma is very different, it's still encouraging to read about other people with PTSD and their experiences, and actually she quotes from a book that she read, which was what made her realise she had PTSD, and the quote actually really summed up my own experience of PTSD. I felt really validated in that. Yeah, not an easy read, not a comfortable read by any stretch of the imagination. Definitely one to be cautious going into if you're sensitive to sexual assault or violence. There's a lot of talk about violence in there as well. There's also references to drug taking. So it's primarily the story of her rape, but she does encounter other women through the book who have also been raped and their stories. Yeah, just be really sensitive to that if you want to read it. I ended up giving it 4 stars, and I would say it's a really valuable book to have read. It's not one I'm gonna reread because it was not an easy book to read. Yeah, so that was that one. So that's 6 books that I have finished reading recently. Let me know if you've read any of those and what you thought of them, and let me know some of the things that you've been reading recently. In the description box below, as I mentioned, I will leave links for each of those books to the book trigger warning website for any of them that are featured on that site, so that you can go and check out all the content warnings. That is a really great resource for you to use to try and find if books are safe for you to read or not. Also in the description box will be links to my social media, so I'm on Instagram, Twitter and on Goodreads, so you can find out how to follow me on those places. And then you can also like this video if you liked it, and think about subscribing if you haven't already, as that will help me grow my channel. But that's it for today, so thank you so much for watching, and I will talk to you again soon. Bye!